No music. Just the sound of a line opening. A calm voice asks a routine question. A question asked thousands of times a day. 911. What's the location of the emergency? Then panic breaks through. A mother struggling to breathe. Her words uneven. Urgent. Desperate. My daughter is missing. She's gone. We can't find her anywhere. The operator asks how old the child is. The pause. 11. That single number changes everything. Because in that moment, this is no longer a delay. It's no longer confusion. It's the instant a family's life splits in two. Hard cut to silence. This is one of those cases that never truly leaves the people it touches. Not the family. Not the investigators. And not the community that lived through it. What began as a missing child call would soon reshape how an entire country thought about safety, trust, and ordinary places. Tonight, we are not here to sensationalize. We are here to understand, to follow what happened, step by step. What was known, what was missed, and how a quiet Florida neighborhood became the center of a national reckoning. This story is difficult, but it matters. On February 1, 2004, the United States was focused on one thing. It was Super Bowl Sunday. Living rooms were full. Televisions were loud. Nearly 90 million people were watching the same game at the same time. The New England Patriots. The Carolina Panthers. A close score that kept everyone on edge until the final moments. During halftime, a performance that would dominate headlines for weeks. The kind of shared cultural moment people still remember exactly where they were for. For many families, the night was just getting started. Food on the table. Friends on the couch. Children nearby, safe at home. It felt like one of those rare evenings when the entire country moved in sync. But over in Sarasota, Florida, the situation was completely different. While most of America was celebrating, a family was growing uneasy. Phone calls were going unanswered. Minutes were stretching longer than they should. The streets were unusually quiet. Not because it was late, but because so many people were indoors watching the same game. That quiet mattered, because in moments like this, silence can hide urgency. In one neighborhood, a routine walk was overdue. In another, a television stayed on while worry crept in. The contrast is hard to ignore. A nation distracted by celebration. A family beginning to realize something was wrong. No sirens yet. No headlines. Just a feeling, subtle at first, that this night was not unfolding the way it should. And while the country cheered, a countdown had already begun. One that no one watching the game could see. To the people who loved her, she was never a case. She was a presence. At McIntosh Middle School, she was known for her warmth. She greeted people the same way every day. Open arms. Easy smiles. Big hugs that felt real. Teachers remembered how quickly she connected. How naturally she made others feel welcome. She didn't force it. It was just who she was. That was the first thing about her. She was affectionate. Comfortable with closeness. Generous with kindness. The second was her energy. She sang in the school choir and loved being part of a group. Music mattered to her. Pop songs played often. Especially Jennifer Lopez. Loud in the car. Louder at home. She liked them all. Not just for shopping, but for being out with friends. Walking. Laughing. Feeling grown, but still safe. And then there was home. She adored her cat. Spent time on the floor, talking to it like it understood. At home, she checked in. She called. She followed routines. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. She liked her parents knowing where she was. Those three things mattered most. Her warmth. Her energy. Her sense of home. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't distant. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was living a normal childhood. And that normalcy matters. Because it reminds us of something hard to accept. Nothing about who she was made this predictable. Nothing about her life invited danger. She was just an 11-year-old girl, moving through a world that still felt familiar. The plan was simple. She would leave her friend's house and head home. A familiar route. About a mile away. It was early evening. The sky still held light. Most families were settling in for the night ahead. At first, no one thought twice about it. But something felt off. Before she left, her friend's mother made a call. Just to be sure. She reached Susan and asked a straightforward question. Was it okay for her to walk home alone? The answer was no. Susan hadn't given permission. The road could be busy. And this wasn't part of the plan. The call ended quickly. And within minutes, Stephen got into the car. He expected this to be routine. A short drive. A quick pickup. Maybe even an apology for the mix-up. But as he drove the streets, that confidence began to fade. He didn't see her. He circled once. Then again. The streets were quieter than usual. Not because it was late, but because it was Super Bowl Sunday. Most people were inside. With every block, the unease grew. She would have called by now. She always did. Minutes passed. Then more. By the time Stephen realized something was truly wrong, fear had already taken hold. Back at home, phones were checked. Friends were called. No one had heard from her. And then the word everyone dreads entered the conversation. Missing. The second call to emergency services came in not long after. This time, the voice on the line sounded different. More urgent. Less hopeful. Questions were asked again. Last known time. Where she was supposed to be. Each answer narrowed the window. Each answer confirmed the same thing. By the time panic set in, she was already gone. At that moment, the night changed. This was no longer a late arrival. No longer confusion. No longer a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a search that would stretch through the night. Through the next morning. And into a reckoning no one was prepared for. Because somewhere between that phone call and the unanswered silence that followed, everything had already slipped out of reach. Police arrived quickly. Patrol cars moved through the neighborhood, lights cutting through the quiet streets. Officers spoke with family members first. Then with neighbors. Then with anyone who might have seen something. Anything out of the ordinary. Door by door they worked outward. Had anyone noticed a child walking alone? A vehicle slowing down? Someone unfamiliar in a familiar place? At this stage, investigators were focused on one thing: time. The first hours after a child disappears are critical. Details are fresh. Memories are clear. Opportunities haven't closed yet. But with every passing minute, the window narrows. As the search expanded, specialized resources were brought in. One of them was a trained bloodhound named Ruby. Handlers used a personal item to help Ruby pick up a scent. She moved with purpose. Confident. Focused. Investigators followed as she led them through streets and side paths, tracking a trail that had grown colder with each step. Then Ruby stopped. The trail ended behind a business along Bridge Road. E's Car Wash. The location immediately raised questions. It was close to where she had last been expected to walk. It sat along a road she would have passed. And it was quiet. Officers secured the area. They spoke with the owner. Asked about foot traffic. Asked about vehicles. Asked about cameras. That last question mattered. Because while witnesses can forget, cameras don't. At that moment, the search shifted. What had started as a neighborhood canvas was becoming something else. More focused. More urgent. Investigators knew they were standing at a crossroads. If the trail truly ended here, then something important had happened in this exact spot. And if that was true, then answers might already exist, recorded, waiting to be found. This is why the early hours matter. Because every decision made now shapes what comes next. What leads are followed. What evidence survives. And whether the truth comes into focus or slips away. Behind the car wash, under the glow of patrol lights, investigators prepared to review what the cameras had captured. Unaware that what they were about to see would change the course of the case, and the country's attention, almost instantly. Inside the car wash office, the room was quiet. Investigators gathered around a monitor. The footage was motion-activated. No sound. No commentary. Just time-stamps and images. They pressed play. The recording was marked 6:21 p.m. The exact window everyone had been trying to understand. At first, the screen showed very little. A stretch of pavement. An ordinary evening. Nothing that immediately stood out. Then a figure entered the frame. A young girl, walking alone. She was wearing a red shirt, blue jeans, a pink backpack, the same outfit she had been described wearing when she left her friend's house. Officers leaned in closer. Seconds later, another figure appeared. An adult male, dark hair, average height, dressed in what looked like a work uniform. A name badge was visible, but the image wasn't clear enough to read it. What mattered wasn't just who appeared, but how. The man didn't rush. He didn't seem lost. He stopped her. They appeared to exchange a few words. And in that brief interaction, investigators saw something that changed the tone of the room completely. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. To the trained eyes watching that screen, it was immediately clear that this moment explained everything that came after. The clip lasted only seconds. But those seconds carried enormous weight. Officers replayed it again. And again. Each time, new details surfaced. The timing. The location. The confidence in the man's movements. This was not random. And the realization settled in fast. The search had just narrowed, dramatically. What had been a missing child case was now centered on one unknown individual, captured on video, in a specific place at a specific time. For investigators, that clarity came with urgency. Because identifying the man in the footage meant identifying where she had gone next. And for the family, although they had not yet seen the video, everything had already shifted. This was no longer a question of delays or wrong turns. Something decisive had happened at 6:21 p.m. Something recorded. Something undeniable. As the footage ended and the screen went dark, the room stayed silent. Everyone there understood the same thing. The answers they were looking for were now inside this image. And time was no longer on their side. With the footage now guiding the investigation, detectives began retracing the moments around it. One detail stood out. A red pickup truck. It had been seen moving through the area around the same time. Back and forth. Close enough to raise questions. In cases like this, investigators follow patterns, not assumptions. They look at who was nearby. Who fit the timing. Who had a reason to be there. That led them to a man named Ron. He owned a red pickup truck. He had been in the area that night. And his connection placed him close to the timeline investigators were trying to reconstruct. Ron was brought in for questioning. He cooperated. Answered calmly. Didn't hesitate. He explained where he had been. What he was wearing. What his routine looked like that evening. Detectives checked everything. His statements were compared against employment records. Time cards were pulled. Work logs reviewed. Every detail mattered. Because when time is tight, even a small inconsistency can change the direction of an entire case. But in this instance, the records told a clear story. Ron had been at work during the critical window. His time card confirmed it. Independent verification backed it up. The truck was searched. Nothing connected it to the disappearance. Slowly, carefully, investigators reached a conclusion. Ron was not the person in the video. He was officially ruled out. And with that, the case took an unsettling turn. Because eliminating a suspect doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes, it deepens the mystery. The footage still showed an unknown man. The trail still ended at the same place. And now, one of the most obvious leads was gone. This is the part of an investigation the public rarely sees. The uncertainty. The wrong turns. The moments where progress feels fragile. For detectives, this meant one thing. They were back to asking the hardest question of all. If it wasn't him, then who was the man in that video? Investigators went back to the footage. Not forward. Not wider. But they slowed it down. Rewound it. Looked at the minutes just before 6:21 p.m. That's when they noticed something they hadn't focused on before. A pale yellow station wagon. It entered the area quietly, parked briefly, then pulled back out onto Bridge Road. Instead of leaving, it slowed, lingering, almost as if the driver was watching. Moments later, the vehicle turned back in. 3 minutes later, the interaction scene on the screen took place. That detail changed everything. Because vehicles leave trails. Investigators rebuilt the timeline again, this time around the station wagon. Where it appeared. When it moved. How long it stayed. This wasn't random traffic. This was positioning. With that realization, the investigation gained focus. Officers began searching for the owner of a yellow Buick station wagon matching the year and model seen in the footage. They checked registrations, interviewed neighbors, asked businesses along Bridge Road if they recognized it. At the same time, the community mobilized. Flyers went up on telephone poles, store windows, street corners. Her face was everywhere. A reward was announced for information that could help identify the person responsible. Phone lines lit up again. Hundreds of calls. Hundreds of tips. Some were hopeful. Some were vague. A few stood out. This is often how breakthroughs happen. Not with one dramatic moment, but with persistence. With people who recognize a detail others overlook. With someone who connects an image on the screen to a memory they can't shake. For the first time since the footage was discovered, investigators felt momentum building again. They now had a vehicle, a window of time, and a growing list of names to work through. It wasn't an answer yet, but it was direction. And in a case like this, direction can mean the difference between a trail that goes cold and one that finally leads somewhere. As flyers spread across Sarasota and beyond, detectives stayed focused on the same question. Who was driving that Buick? As the hours turned into days, the search moved beyond police lines and patrol cars. It reached living rooms, newsrooms, kitchen tables across the country. At a press conference, Susan stood before microphones, holding herself together with visible effort. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She spoke directly to her daughter. She said she loved her. She said she was waiting. She said the phone was always on. It wasn't a statement for cameras. It was a plea meant for one person. Nearby, her father spoke too. Not as an official, not as a soundbite, but as a parent hoping his words might somehow reach beyond the noise. He asked her to come home, reminded her that she was loved, that she wasn't alone. Those moments spread quickly. Television networks carried them live. Clips replayed throughout the day. Viewers who had never heard her name before suddenly knew her face. In Sarasota, the response was immediate. Neighbors gathered outside the family's home. Candles were lit. Hands were held. People who had never met the family stood together in silence, united by the same fear every parent understands. This was no longer just a local emergency. It had become a national moment. A shared concern that cut across distance and difference. For investigators, the attention brought both pressure and possibility. More eyes meant more tips. More memories triggered. More chances that someone, somewhere, would recognize a detail. For the family, it meant something else entirely. Hope, fragile but still present. As candle flames flickered in the dark, the message was clear. This child mattered. This family mattered. And until answers came, a community, and a country, would not look away. The break did not come from a lab. It came from a living room. A woman was watching the news when the surveillance footage appeared again. She had seen it before. But this time, something felt different. She called her husband into the room. They watched in silence. The walk. The posture. The way the man moved his arm. They didn't see a stranger. They saw someone they knew. A former business partner. The recognition wasn't dramatic. It was unsettling. The kind that settles slowly and refuses to go away. They contacted police and gave a name. That name immediately caught investigators' attention. Because it wasn't the first time they had heard it. Out of hundreds of tips, several had already pointed to the same person. Detectives moved quickly. They arrived at a house connected to the man identified. Neighbors confirmed he was home. Officers waited. When he appeared, nothing about the moment felt rushed. It felt cautious. Measured. They knew this stage mattered. The man's name was Joseph Smith. He was 37 years old. A father. Unemployed. And on probation. That detail changed the tone of the encounter. Probation meant conditions. Restrictions. Oversight. It also meant investigators had legal ground to ask deeper questions. They looked closely. At his clothing history. At a mechanic-style work uniform. At visible tattoos that appeared consistent with what could be seen in the footage. Smith agreed to speak. He denied being at the car wash. Denied recognizing the moment on the screen. When shown a still image, his response was careful. "It looks like me," he said. "But it isn't." Investigators have heard that line before. But this time, it didn't stand alone. The pattern mattered. Multiple independent tips. A familiar walk. Clothing consistent with the video. A background that raised serious concerns. None of it was proof on its own. Together, it was something else. This is how many cases turn. Not with a single piece of evidence, but with recognition. When separate observations align. When instincts are confirmed by repetition. By the end of that day, Joseph Smith was no longer just a name among many. He had become the central focus of the investigation. And for the first time, the unknown man in the video had an identity. As investigators focused their attention on Joseph Smith, the case began to shift inward. Away from patrol cars. Away from press conferences. And into the private spaces where truth is often hardest to face. Detectives reached out to Joseph's family, starting with his brother, John. The two men were not close. Their relationship had been strained for years, marked by distance, distrust, and unresolved history. But John agreed to speak. At first, he was cautious, measured. He said he had nothing concrete to offer, only a feeling he couldn't explain. He had seen the footage, and once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The walk looked familiar. The posture. The rhythm of movement. After a back injury years earlier, Joseph's gait had changed. To John, that detail stood out immediately. Then there was the behavior. In the days after the disappearance, Joseph had been acting differently. Restless. Distracted. Preoccupied. John recalled late-night visits. Unusual conversations. Moments that felt off even at the time. None of it was proof. But taken together, it raised concern. While family members struggled with doubt, investigators pursued something more concrete. They sent the surveillance footage for advanced analysis. Experts enhanced the image of the name badge visible on the man's uniform. What came back was brief, but significant. One word. Joe. That detail didn't solve the case. But it narrowed the field even further. By now, pressure was mounting on all sides. Joseph was questioned again. He denied involvement. Remained outwardly cooperative. But privately, something was breaking. Investigators allowed a conversation between Joseph and his family, hoping it might lead somewhere words spoken to police could not. What followed was not a clear admission. It was something more fragile. Joseph spoke in fragments. Apologies without explanations. Regret without clarity. John later described it as being close. Close to understanding. Close to the truth. But never fully there. When the conversation ended, John stepped away shaken. He didn't know what to believe. He worried about what Joseph might be capable of. And he feared what it would mean if his suspicions were right. Later that night, John reached out to investigators again. Not with certainty, but with urgency. Something had been said. Something that suggested answers existed, somewhere. This is often how cases unravel. Not in a single confession. Not in one decisive moment. But through pressure. Through the quiet collapse of a story that can no longer hold. By the end of this phase, investigators understood one thing clearly. Joseph Smith was no longer just a suspect. He was at the center of everything. And the truth, whatever it was beginning to surface, whether he was ready for it or not. In the early hours, investigators moved quietly. There were no cameras nearby. No press. No public statements yet. Just confirmation. What had begun as hope narrowed into certainty. And with that certainty came a responsibility no officer ever wants to carry. Later that day, the sheriff stood before microphones. His voice steady, but strained. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with intention. He confirmed that the search for the missing child had reached its end. That she had been located. That the outcome was not what anyone had prayed for. He called her beautiful. He said her name. And in that moment, the weight of the case shifted from urgency to grief. Inside her home, the news landed differently. Susan's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. A sound that came from somewhere deeper than language. It was not meant for public ears. It was the sound of a parent realizing that waiting was over, and that everything had changed. That moment would not be replayed often. Nor should it be. Some grief is too personal to carry beyond the room where it happens. Outside, the community gathered. People arrived without being asked. Neighbors. Strangers. Parents holding children closer than usual. Flowers appeared. Candles followed. The air was heavy, but quiet. No speeches. No chanting. Just people standing together, trying to make sense of something that could not be explained. At McIntosh Middle School, administrators made an announcement. Classes continued, but support was made available. Counselors were brought in. Teachers opened their doors. Students were given space to talk. Or not talk at all. For many of them, this was the first time they understood that something like this could happen in a place that felt familiar. That realization would stay with them. For the investigators, there was no pause. Even as the community mourned, the work continued. Paperwork, evidence, procedures. Because while the search had ended, the process had not. But for the family, and for Sarasota, the line had been crossed. There would be no more waiting for a call. No more listening for footsteps. No more hoping the door would open. From this point forward, remembrance would replace anticipation. And the question everyone now carried was no longer where is she? But how does a community move forward after losing a child who should have come home? That answer would take years. The courtroom became the next chapter. Not a place of answers, but a place of procedure. Months after the search ended, the case moved into the legal system, where every detail would be examined slowly, deliberately, and in public. Evidence was presented. Timelines reconstructed. Witnesses called. For the family, this stage was not about curiosity. It was about endurance. Day after day, they listened as events were described in careful, legal language. Not to relive them, but to establish responsibility. The judge reminded the jury of their role. To weigh facts. To set emotion aside. That was easier said than done. When the verdict was announced, the room was still. The jury found Joseph Smith responsible for what had happened. There was no applause. No relief. Only a sense that one question had finally been answered. Then came sentencing. This phase carried its own weight. Statements were read. Impact was discussed. Family members spoke about absence, not in dramatic terms, but in quiet ones. Holidays that would never feel the same. A bedroom that remained untouched. A future that had simply stopped. The judge issued the sentence under Florida law as it existed at the time. For some, it felt like justice. For others, it felt like something incomplete. But at least it felt final. Or so it seemed. Years later, the case returned to the headlines, not because of new evidence, but because of a legal shift. The United States Supreme Court issued a ruling affecting how the most severe sentences must be decided. The decision required unanimity from juries, a standard that had not been applied in this case. That ruling sent shockwaves through Florida's justice system. And it reopened wounds that many families believed had already begun to scar over. Joseph Smith's sentence was reconsidered. Courtrooms filled again. Lawyers argued. Judges reviewed. For the Brucia family, it felt like being pulled backward. They spoke publicly about frustration. About exhaustion. About the feeling that the process cared more about procedure than people. Each ruling brought uncertainty. Each delay extended the timeline. At times, the sentence was reinstated. At others, it was set aside pending further review. The legal system moved carefully, but slowly. And in that slowness, closure remained just out of reach. This phase revealed a hard truth. The justice system is not designed to heal. It is designed to decide. And for families, that distinction matters. A ruling can end a case on paper, but it cannot restore what was lost. It cannot rewind time, and it cannot erase memory. For the Brucia family, the courtroom became a place they never wanted to return to, yet kept being called back into. Justice in this chapter was not a single moment. It was a long, uneven process. One that forced a family to relive the same loss again and again, each time the law shifted beneath their feet. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. The verdict had spoken. But closure, true closure, remained elusive. And the consequences of that reality would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. As the legal process stretched on, another question began to take shape. What would remain after the case itself faded from headlines? For Carly's family, grief slowly turned into resolve. They began to speak not only about loss, but about prevention. Her father started looking beyond his own experience. Reading, researching, connecting with other parents whose children had vanished after systems failed to act in time. What he found was unsettling. Again and again he saw the same pattern. Repeat offenders. Missed warnings. Opportunities to intervene that never came. Out of that frustration came an idea. A proposal known as Carly's Law. The goal was simple in theory, to close gaps that allowed high-risk individuals to remain free after repeated violations. To strengthen oversight. To respond faster when warning signs appeared. Lawmakers took notice. Political leaders spoke at press conferences. They referenced Carly's name as a symbol of what happens when safeguards fall short. Supporters argued that the cost of inaction was far greater than any budget line. That protecting children was not optional. It was fundamental. But legislation moved slowly. Debates followed. Opposition formed. Concerns about funding and scope stalled progress. In the end, Carly's Law did not pass as originally envisioned. For the family, that outcome was painful, but not the end. Because legacy does not always take the shape of policy. Sometimes, it lives in places far quieter. Behind a church in Sarasota, a memorial garden began to take form. A simple space. Flowers. Stone. A place to sit. One man became its caretaker. He tended the garden regularly. Pulled weeds. Replaced plants. Restored what time and neglect wore down. For him, it was personal. He spoke about loss. About the need for somewhere peaceful to remember. Somewhere to reflect. The garden became more than a memorial. It became a reminder. Parents brought children there. Volunteers gathered. Safety rallies were held in Carly's name. Conversations happened, honest ones. About awareness. About vigilance. About how quickly ordinary moments can change. Years passed. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children grew older. But Carly's presence remained. Not as a headline. Not as a statistic. But as a name tied to awareness. To caution. To love that refused to disappear. This is the long shadow of a case like this. It reaches beyond courtrooms and laws. Beyond verdicts and appeals. It settles into communities. Into routines. Into how parents hold their children just a little closer. Carly's story did not end when the cameras moved on. It continued. In gardens, in conversations, and in the quiet determination to make sure no child is ever reduced to a lesson without meaning. That is legacy. Not resolution. But remembrance with purpose. Years passed. Court filings slowed. Headlines grew quieter. And eventually, the case that had once consumed a nation faded into the background of public attention. Then, in the summer of 2021, news broke quietly. Joseph Smith had passed away while in state custody. There was no dramatic announcement. No courtroom reaction. Just a brief statement confirming that the long legal process had reached its natural end. For the public, it was a footnote. For the family, it was complicated. Carly's father spoke openly about what the news meant and what it didn't. He said it did not bring joy. It did not bring celebration. But it did bring an ending to years of uncertainty. No more hearings. No more appeals. No more waiting for the system to decide what would happen next. In his words, it was relief without peace. Because nothing about this outcome restored what was taken. The loss was already permanent. And yet, questions remained. During the years Joseph Smith spent in custody, investigators began to look again at other unresolved cases. Disappearances and incidents that shared troubling similarities. Names resurfaced. Files were reopened. Possibilities were discussed. But without new statements, without clear admissions, those questions stayed unanswered. One case in particular continued to trouble those familiar with the details. A young woman. A long cold investigation. circumstances that never fully made sense. Authorities acknowledged the potential connection. But without sufficient evidence, no formal conclusions were reached. With Smith's passing, those answers may now be lost forever. That reality sits heavily in cases like this. Because when accountability ends without full truth, uncertainty remains. For Carly's family, the focus slowly shifted away from the man responsible. Not out of forgiveness, but out of necessity. They chose to speak more about her than about him. To remember who she was, not who harmed her. In the end, this chapter closed not with justice fulfilled, but with proceedings concluded. The system stopped moving. Time moved on. And what remained was not triumph, but reflection. Reflection on how long the process took. On how much energy was spent navigating procedure. And on how many lives were permanently changed along the way. Joseph Smith's story ended quietly. Carly's did not. It continued, in memory, in community awareness, and in the quiet promise that her life would not be reduced to the person who took it from her. That distinction matters. Because even when a case ends, its impact does not. Years later, the memorial garden still stands. Not untouched. Not perfect. But cared for. Hands return to it again and again. Pulling weeds. Replanting flowers. Repairing what time quietly wears down. It is not a place of spectacle. It is a place of pause. The place where people come to sit. To think. To remember. This is where Carly's story now lives most clearly. Not in court records. Not in headlines, but in the way her name is spoken, gently, deliberately. Her mother, Susan, carried a weight few could imagine. Her grief followed her everywhere. Friends remember her as devoted, deeply loving, and forever changed. Even after her passing, people still speak of the bond she shared with her daughter. The phone calls. The routines. The love that never faded. For Carly's family, remembering her means more than looking back. It means speaking her name often, keeping her photos close, sharing stories that existed long before that night. She is remembered as a girl who hugged freely, who loved music, who felt safe in the ordinary rhythms of home. That is who she was. And that matters. Because cases like this risk becoming reduced to timelines and outcomes, to procedures and decisions. But Carly was not a lesson. She was a life. The lasting message here is not fear, but awareness. Awareness of how quickly normal moments can change. Of why communication matters. Of why paying attention, even when nothing seems wrong, can make a difference. Vigilance does not mean panic. It means care. It means staying present. Asking questions. Looking out for one another. If there is anything this story leaves behind, it is this. Children are not statistics. Families are not footnotes. And remembrance is an act of responsibility. Carly Brucia should be remembered not for how her story ended, but for who she was before it ever began. If her story encourages even one person to be more aware, and more protective of the ordinary moments we take for granted, then her memory continues to serve a purpose beyond tragedy. And that is how she should be remembered. Not as a case, but as Carly. If this case held your attention, subscribe to Iman Crime Files for more documented investigations. New cases are uploaded regularly. Most crimes don't begin with violence. They begin with silence.